This is Dave Monk of Prairie Monk, WEFT, Champaign 90.1 on your FM dial. And folks, it's been an interesting 2 weeks or so. We've been working through some of the things that not-for-profit agencies do or don't do. And we don't always get to cover our suggestions, but so we're not always doing what we say you ought to do, but we're aware, and this has been quite an experience. We're in a warehouse that's occupied by multiple personnel, and the masons and electricians, and each has an area. Well, Amazon has been looking for a big building like that to use as a distributor, and they found it, and they would like to get in there very quickly. So we were on a month-to-month lease, so we get to go immediately. Some of the others are on longer leases, so they don't have to go quite so soon. But it's like an 18,000-foot warehouse, and it has all manner of things. So part of doing field work for natural areas is that you have to have a place from which to work. The warehouse has been rather wonderful. It has an apartment at one end, which provides us with the warmth and protection of slides. We have about 80,000 slides, a lot of flat pictures, and some of these are essential for continuing Heartland Pathways as an agency. The people who come on board have to know where we are, where our prairies are, and what goes on with them. And so kindness is for me to leave that sort of information. So warehousing is important, and we'll go through some of the things that is important for. But Bonneville is just a little far out of town. It's about 4 miles from west side of Champaign, probably 7 miles from Urbana, and it has been remarkable. The temperature control helps us preserve things. The space allows us to preserve items, and the items might include lumber. If people have not experienced a barn and cannot see how it was put together without nails, they need to see a beam. It might be 17 inches across and square. That means a lot in terms of history. If you are going to go to Wisconsin as a recent colonial, you're going to go and take some huge trees down, never to be found again. These trees have been growing for thousands and thousands of years. But guess what? If you're a colonial and you have your God-given right to go into another country and take its resources immediately, and that's happening in the Amazon, and we get very upset about it. But guess what? We have the same problem ourselves in the Midwest. Those trees, if they come from Wisconsin, are probably yellow pine. And if you have a beam, a square beam that's 17 inches by 17 inches, you know that you have had to kill a huge tree. And those elevators, wooden elevators, are not efficient anymore compared with concrete elevators, so they get burned. And we've been lucky enough to work with the demolishers of a Staley elevator just on the west side of Champaign that allowed us to take sistered wood. When an elevator is put up adjacent to a railroad line, you can't load your elevator from the railroad line. You have to have a siding. Most of the sidings are small, old sidings. The current grain shippers would like to have 125 cars. So in effect, this is inefficient to have to send an engine out to 2 or 3 little elevators and collect the grain, a few cars at a time. And so there's a tendency for the main lines to eliminate the grain lines. It so happens that the Jeffersonian plat, Jefferson decided that people didn't know where they were finding their sight unseen purchase of land. The rock had been moved or the tree had been killed or whatever. So he put forth a Jeffersonian plat, north, south, east, and west plat. So when you're driving in east central Illinois, you're driving on squares. And those elevators are about 5 miles apart. And they're 5 miles apart because a horse can't cart grain more than 8 miles with and without being exhausted. So that's about what controls the 5 miles. And if you're in a plane and you're up in the sky, you look down and you'll see that all railroad lines, all about 5 miles apart, they crisscrossed, and there was a Steigers Act, and the Steigers Act recognized this and recognized inefficient railroad beds, and they gave the short lines permission to retire. The permission was probably activated by a derailment, lack of maintenance, and the reality that there was not a good collection situation. These days you have a super elevator like a Cargill's just west of Champaign, which has 2 or 3 or 4 lines into it, and they can assemble 125 cars, sometimes 200 cars to go out as a major shipment to overseas or to mills, and it's a different cat. So you have a lot of transportation on the road. So if the railroad company gets into the act and is not happy with the collecting all the grain, they put the price of the elevator up to the rental of the elevator up till it was prohibitive, and so that grain goes on the line on the road. Semi-trailers taking grain don't pay the taxes that it costs to maintain those roads, so not very helpful in a way. It's convenient; you can take a semi-trailer wherever you want it, but not so good for road maintenance, and not so good for gasoline. So, okay, we have that small elevator. It burrowed a hole in the ground that gave it a balance. The nature of the beams is important because this elevator has to stay erect. Wooden elevators are not nearly as strong as circular concrete elevators, and so they would burst. Shut this up. So they planked the elevator with 10x2s for a certain amount, 8x2s, certain amount, laying flat, 6x2s, and then 4x2s. So you had this grain elevator that was pretty stable. It had several bins. You had to be very careful to load the bins equally, or in the soft soil of the Midwest, good glaciated soil, the elevator would fall over. So people who manage elevators know to load them carefully and equally on each side. There's a little man elevator inside, and you can go up to the top, and there's a gear head. It's called a gear head, and you can move the pipes around to put grain in different bins. You can also work on it to do corn or soybeans. But the elevators didn't always service just corn and soybeans. Before there was corn and soybeans, there was cattle. So usually around each elevator, there's a cattle yards where livestock would be sent to market, especially Chicago. It didn't always mean just cattle. In many cases, we were lacking prairie chickens because prairie chickens were kind of delightful to eat. And so you didn't have refrigerated cars, but you did have cars that rolling stock cars that had ice in them, and you sent literally thousands of prairie chickens to Chicago. They probably were an aberration of the ecosystem, because if you were in a horse era, you needed to have oats and grain for the horses to eat. When they were working, you had a nose bag, and the horses could eat their oats or what have you while they were working. Horses were a friendly crowd. Oxen were too. Oxen were around because they had cloven feet and they could help with drainage. An oxen could work with muddy conditions. Horses aren't very good at that. So we just had a conversation in the car about how you controlled oxen, and you had a long whip. It might be 18 feet long with a little unit on the end, which made it crack. And if you had a team of 10 or 12 oxen and you wanted George Willie to go a little faster, or you not be so rambunctious, then you cracked the whip across on top of him. It made a noise. It didn't hit him or her or whatever. But if you weren't very careful and you weren't educated in the use of an 18-foot whip, you had it wrapped around your ears, and it can be very painful. So there are people who manage horses and oxen very differently. Some are very demanding. They almost cruel to their animals. There are others that lean on their animals, scratch behind their horns, just get to be very friendly, and they're part of the family. Those I like better than the other, but you had both types of groups working the drainage. Okay, back to the elevators. We have beams, and part of the teaching about what was and what is that these elevators were built with wood that had hardly any knots in them. Sometimes it came from Texas, sometimes it came from the north. We suspect the Staley elevator grain came from the north, yellow pine, and when they're taken down, you can figure out that the people who made them put the nails in a row, so you can saw down the corridor of nails and avoid having a nail run through your brain. So you take out segments, about 5 or 6 planks at once, and these planks are rather wonderful. And we would have students to split them out with wedges and crowbars, and those planks have mostly gone to people who can use them, and we use them ourselves to make signs, and it's kind of rustic signs rather than a plastic new sign on our natural areas. So we've stored that sort of material in our warehouse. We've had space for students to work like that. We have a room for people to run their radio while they work, or to be friendly with each other. That's the marvel of the warehouse that we have been in. It's strategic. It's right next to a railroad line we'd like to acquire. Let me remind you that we're rerailing 4 miles of Heartland Pathways territory that's been abandoned, and the rail fittings have been taken. And that will take a long time to happen, because in a normal railroad, you have 2,000 ties per mile. But that comes from Whiteheath to Seymour. If you get onto your internet, you can waddle your way along on a satellite feed. From Seymour to Staley, that's Seymour, Bonneville to Staley, is about 7 miles, and it's intact at the moment. So we've created a Champaign, Havana, and Western historic railroad, and its aim is to we're contiguous with the active railroad museum. This line flows out. It was an Illinois Central line, and 7 miles was saved intact by the Monticello Railroad Museum. It's tremendously popular, and it lets people know a different era. So to the east, the line is intact from Seymour to Bonneville to Staley, and we want it to remain intact. That means we have to raise the money to buy that portion, and that'll cost about $3 million at least. We just had a sale of land at Monticello, 8,100 an acre, because it's near to town. But we watch those sites because they can be interesting adjunct territory to other natural areas like Lodge Park and Shady Rest and Allerton Park and Friends Creek. You make, in retrospect, a mass of natural area that can be inviting of herons and all sorts of small mammals, meadow voles and ground squirrels, and forest near the river of the Sangamon, and prairie outside of it a little bit. So it's good to retain these areas, but as it gets closer to development, so the price goes up. Average farm sale at the moment for similar territory on the Sarasota moraine, so it has not as productive for grain, and this has, since it is on the Sarasota moraine, it has rolling territory, so that is helpful. It gives people who are riding historic trains an idea of what the landscape was like. You had the ice melting and leaving rocks and rubble to the extent that the mountains of East Central Illinois are moraines that are about 50 feet high. And that's, so you don't have a lot of terrestrial ambiance in Champaign County, for instance. it was a swampy territory with the last settled county. So you watch these things and hope there'll be some regional planning that lets us save some of the remnant prairie, which has been evolving after like 10,000 years ago since the glaciers retreated. And people are planting prairies, even in the forest preserve. The Champaign County was 94% prairie. And our ecosystem is down to the state having preserved 0.01% of the ecosystem that was here when people came. They dared to take every inch because it was wealthy soil. 6 inches of humus go down 4 feet with roots, and access to water for prairie, access to water for forest, but only on well-drained areas like the Sangamon River, or the Ombra, or the Salt Fork. So watching this development is a little disturbing, because if you have an ecosystem that is denied, then eventually you're in bad shape, because biology works on biodiversity. And let me tell you, cattle on the moraine, because it's a little bit more rough and ready, and corn and soybeans on the Drummer and the Flanagan soils that are well drained and deep, and very wonderful humus. But all those soils have been cultivated. There's no humus anymore. There's no root drainage to 4 feet down. It's one of the cruelest things in the world. We pride ourselves on criticizing the Brazilian Amazonians for taking out trees, but our own ecosystem is almost dead. You can't run a world like that. The world doesn't work that way. Just too many humans. And when you get out of balance like that, you tend to get strange things happening, like you start to lose all your ecosystem. Wonderful creatures, birds and bees and what have you, are dying like flies. So we're very shortly going to be humans by themselves, and humans by themselves are dependent on a biodiverse natural area. And here we are down to 0.01%. What is that? How do we handle that? How does Mr. Trump handle that? Well, often the last pieces of remnant prairie, one at Rockford at the moment, is making way for an Ameren airport. Rockford is becoming an adjunct airport for Chicago, and Amazon is into it. And the natural history people are not into it, and very justifiably so. The engineers would say, let's move this cat and you can have it over there. But ecosystems don't do that. It's hard to convince people who have other money in mind and a different background in engineering, perhaps, which often comes without a lot of sociology or ecology. So at the moment, there are court injunctions to stop that. It used to be a huge area, and then it got whittled down to 25 acres. George Fell and his wife, Barbara, sat on that thing for years and tried to stop it going out of action, and they succeeded. And George Fell realized that when he had that sort of responsibility, he was a student at the University of Illinois, and he was working with early ecologists, and those ecologists were renting or had an agreement with the Big Four and those other railroads to retain the prairie for research and doctoral programs and undergraduate education. And so even today, we're developing a Kickapoo Trail that is god awful wide, and that takes out the natural ecosystem, the remnant prairie on either side. And it's very popular. So when George went off to Washington, he created a nature conservancy. It's now worldwide, and it buys plots of land and works with agencies like the state and not-for-profit people, and they have saved a lot of natural areas. Even reconstruction prairies in some cases, but reconstruction prairies are interesting and helpful and gives you an idea of what a prairie is, but it's nothing like the biodiversity of a natural prairie. George came back to Illinois. He sort of got fired by his support group because they wanted to do one thing on Long Island rather than what George wanted to do, was to have chapters throughout the country and eventually through the world. So George came back to Illinois and spent 23 years working with Illinois. One of the first things he did was to produce a forest preserve. Everyone likes a forest. You can hug the tree, you can sit under its shade, you can harvest it for lumber. It whittles, hangs in the wind. And the alternative, which is our ecosystem in East Central Illinois, is a prairie. And it's not nearly as inviting for those that have been digging it up for years. It's a weed. A weed is growing out of place. Well, it was very much growing in place before farmers decided to make it a weed. They would get rid of it, plow it under, and then get good yields for their crops. Very little of that remains. So people get surprised that we're working with natural history, but we're also working with railroads. Why are you working with railroads? That's an aberration. Well, it's not. It's the only place where there's any prairie left growing. That and in dead cemeteries is to have a reserve plot of land with them. So railroads are essential to us, whether they're alive or dead. And if they're dead, the prairie will creep up on the ballast, and they'll sort themselves out according to the moisture gradient. So the little blue stem and the wild strawberries will grow on the ballast itself after 20 years or after 50 years, and it returns. The live railroad will have a 25-foot easement and probably use only 10 feet of it. And the vegetation, if you're lucky and have an agreement with the power lines and the railroaders, then you're going to save your prairie. So we try to do that. Doesn't always work. The power companies have found herbicide, and they tend to use an herbicide that kills trees for 3 years ahead of time. And you can guess what remains of your 130 prairie species that can grow on that place. So we have lost, even today, when you're down to 0.01%, you're still losing prairies. And there's a demand of why are we doing this? It's for the good of people, and you're doing business. And yes, other people have done it. why can't we? Well, when you're down to nothing, then the price of what you're saving is worth more, and it's more important. So we need to watch developments, especially the development in Rockford, which went from thousands of acres to 25 acres to 14 acres. So when George went to put in a forest preserve, the politicians got into the act, and recreation is much more favorable than prairie preservation, and so it got modified. So a forest preserve has more right to look after recreation, and then George went ahead and organized a Vermilion County Conservation District, and the Conservation District has more right to preserve little bits of prairie. They've also, the Vermilion one will get more rambunctious. There are fault lines that allow the accumulation of coal in the Carboniferous era. A lot of underground interest, and there's rivers that comes through from Ford County, from Champaign County, from Indiana into the Vermilion, into the Wabash, into the Ohio, into the Mississippi, and down in the Gulf. And they are fairly nice rivers if you leave them that way. If you decide to put secondary tailings off of a power company into the creek, then you screw it. If you decide to put tailings down a mine, you can also screw up your aquifers. If you just let it run down the river and cause a dead zone in the Gulf, you have a problem. And it's not in every country. It is dominant in the Midwest. So when you look at what we're doing, you look for how to do it. And part of how to do it is have a dunghill from which to work. And that means shovels and fire flappers and equipment. And you need a little studio where you can talk to people and introduce them to what the problem is and what they might do. You have them out helping to burn prairies, to help to harvest prairies. It's important to have that sort of facility and a few items around. You don't want to become a museum, but there are things that you can show people how the biological diversity of a prairie works. So a center in Iowa, which is called the Ian Smith Center, is a recreation on cornfield. It's not the best nature because it takes nature thousands of years to develop this humus and the natural ecosystem, and to have the seed sort itself out according to the moisture gradient. So little blue stem on the hill, cordgrass down on the Drummer and Flanagan. And they've got thousands of acres and enough to have buffalo. But they've got a $1 million visitor center. And that is important. It's right adjacent to Prairie City. Prairie City's a little burg. You blink your eye, you've gone through Prairie City. But people realized this was prairie. And Iowa has mainly prairie. It doesn't have the Shawnee Forest of Illinois. And you don't have that temptation to go north and south the same way as Illinois. In the south, it has the ecosystem of the southern. You get cypress and hanging moss, and it's almost like what you get in New Orleans. But as you go through the state, you get to the other extreme, which is the alpine forest in the north. pine and some of the materials we use for elevators. So we tend to want a visitor center that has some of these examples. It might be a diorama of a prairie, giving an idea of the roots and the shoots and the above ground fruiting bodies. The compass plant is famous for being having leaves that face north and south. The average horseman that went 100 miles and didn't have an indication of north and south because prairies didn't have a tree in them, then you're going to back on your back doorstep, which is very frustrating. But they discovered this plant that had north and south facing the leaves so that the sun didn't dry the drought-stricken plant out. You have to know there's a spring rain and there's a summer drought and there's a fall rain. So in that middle part is drought, and trees don't do very well in that. The prairie does quite well, thank you. The leaves roll to prevent the loss of water. The compass plant is hairy to prevent wind from getting into the stomata on the leaves, the breathing portions of the leaves. It is resinous. It is tough. It has a deep root. It goes down. We have the top 4 feet, the top 2 feet, weighing 44 pounds, and a crown that's like 10 inches across. And you don't know how old that is, but certainly it's been part of the scenery for a long time. And we need desperately to know the ecology of these plants, because they're not just by themselves. They have rootlets that go out, and sometimes there are fungi that are neighbors, and they'll take some material from the plant and give at the same time. So it's a sharing, and we're finding out more and more that that is essential, especially if you remove one tree, then you notice that a whole bunch of other trees die. You know that one is dependent on the other. That will happen with aspens, for instance. If you take out the associated plants, then bingo, you lost the trees too. We need to know these things, so we need to have people out there doing it. And a warehouse is tremendous. You need the one we've had is about 18,000 feet. And we have items of coal. You can cut coal, and you can find the foraminifera, or the plants that are in it that's fossilized. But if you bring the coal out of its lack of oxygen, that will disappear in no time. Yeah. So some of the underground coal we have nearby at, say, Vermilion County is likely to lose its character very quickly. But it's part of the act, and it's part of the sociology. The people in Danville often came from Kentucky. So if you have a homecoming day at DeLand or somewhere, you're likely to feel the sound of Kentucky, or Tennessee, or Mississippi. So we need to watch that happening today. When we put in a rail trail, and we have the potential to go from Monticello to Clinton, then you're going through towns that can profit from this. Profit is a tremendous drive. Can't get away from it. Some people like to invade a railroad bed, but most people have been very kind and kept off of it. But what they have done is creep up onto the side of the ballast and take out the very prairie that we're trying to preserve. not realizing that this is their agronomic heritage, and they're screwing it, and massively, especially if it's close to corn and soybeans, and it will never come back. What we've got now is we've taken out the humus. We're more or less growing corn the same way as you would grow a pea in a petri dish. You're adding fertilizer. The humus is gone. The soil is much changed in just 100 years. We've screwed it. Not very happy. And you see that you have to think about extinction in a few years' time. It might be 200 years, it might be 500 years. But if you persist in having an ecosystem that has one group dominant, like a virus, it's going to win. And you have the lemmings, and the lemmings will have a J curve. You will have lemmings building up and building up because they have lots of young ones, and then all of a sudden there's a J curve, and they die, or they walk out over. They do something that kills them out, or a virus gets them, or whatever, and then gradually it comes back again. We're lucky that it comes back, because many times we're harvesting creatures willy-nilly, like the Europeans on the migration places where you have things like warblers. They're eating warblers, and so we have to be very careful. And some of the climate changes that we're looking at are because we've run in as colonials with the right of God to take out trees and take out ecosystems and get rid of all the bees and whatever. And then we're happy we can live in a country house and do what we do. But it's not a good sign for survival. So part of a warehouse is to preserve the dignity of that environment. It's where you get people together, you get to be friendly, you point out the economic values, you're teaching. So many of our pieces of junk are not really pieces of junk, they're teaching aids. Whether it's a block of coal or whether it's a 17-inch piece of wood, or whether it's been given a three-dimensional image by thousands of tons of grain running over it and eroding it and creating a new atmosphere. We look for ideas that will let young people get a mind of their own and be able to go to these places. Some of our greatest thought powers start at 1 and 2 and 3. Some of them start with it in the womb to learn how to survive in a different way. It's teaching people how to think, how to not be told what you're going to do tomorrow, but to suggest 2 or 3 alternatives. As adult, you're working with a child, you're wanting that child to start thinking, and they're not able to because their brain is not developed yet. So you very kindly introduce them to several variables, and then they work with that, and gradually, by the age of 8 and 10 and 14, they are thinking and asking questions. Like Greta, she's asking questions of adults. Do we just run in and take over and grab the resource and use the native people as the slave trade to get what they need and pay nothing? And so how are we going to survive if we don't do something about the ecosystem that we're part of? So there we have a problem in downtown Champaign. It's getting gentrified. So we came to downtown Champaign when it was a dead central business district. Everyone had run off to the mall, and that was the popular place. And we could occupy buildings, not just because they were cheap to occupy, because engraving and the like had been losing out to the internet, but we tend to think we might be able to help in a way. So helping is what we do. It's often inspirational. We've inspired the creation of a Grand Prairie Friends, of natural areas that they now have done the whole work themselves, but that didn't inspire it. There's someone has to kick this into action. That means you have to have the guts to do it. And that when the Rail Banking Act came in, that permitted groups like the Grand Prairie Friends to take over a railroad, and in an interim basis. It was called the Rail Banking Act, and the rail banking people felt that they were saving corridors that they may need in the future. So they saw that hikers and bikers and biologists were buying these railroad beds that were being abandoned. And they said, we'll help you out. We'll save the bridges, which is the first thing to go, because bridges are a liability. Someone might just fall off the bridge and kill themselves. So bridges come out early. And believe me, bridges are costly to put back. So if you have a rail trail and the bridge is out, then it's going to cost you $2 million to put the dumb thing back again. So the railroad at the federal level, the Surface Transportation Board is like the federal Department of Transportation, and they work with the abandoning railroad line. And in our case, to the east of Urbana, it was Conrail, and you have to have an agreement with the local yokels, and the local yokels have to buy the railroad bed. Well, no agency in this region was game to buy that railroad line. It wasn't going to cost that much, but it was essential. It's used to keep the locals honest. So if they're going to do something, they're going to have an investment involved, which is a purchase of a railroad line. If a railroad wants to come back in, they have to buy the rail bed back. But it's preserved for them if they want to come back. It's interim trail use. And so that helps to save the biology. It also helps provide some recreation, but you got to be careful that you don't make it so wide that you can preserve the dignity of the prairie on either side. And unfortunately, roads followed railroad lines. It was easy to run adjacent to a railroad line, and when they're expanded, they're often expanded out of the prairie on the railroad rather than out of on the farming side. So road widening, you have to look and see. These guys taking out natural prairie. I did that at the airport road, and I knew it was a remnant prairie. And so I put down perhaps 200 little flags here and there, and the contractors didn't know what the hell was going on. But some of the people who knew about conservation said, well, it's only a quarter of a mile long, and that's not enough to justify its existence. We're going to widen the airport road at Airport Road. Yeah. So we came to a compromise, and we took tree spoons full of prairie. A tree spoon is a wire cage that you poke down into the soil, and you bring up perhaps 3 feet of soil. And at the counterpart, you make a hole that matches that volume, and they had a prairie at the instigation of people who wanted to maintain prairie and let people see what the ecosystem for this region was. They had that at most of the rest stops at a lot of justification. So it's mainly grass prairies, not biodiverse, but it was one. And at Pisodum, they had a visitor center on 57. So we were involved in saying that is good prairie. And we put about 30 of these tree spoons full. I got accused of costing $40,000 or something, some humongous amount. They spent about $1 million worth of equipment came. They took it 9 miles and they planted it, and it grew and it grew, and it was wonderful. And about 10 years later, they decided to expand this sewage treatment lines. And guess where the sewage treatment lines came from? Out of the mixture of planted prairie and remnant prairie. And if you get involved at all, very shortly there's a policeman and there's an arrest, and there's sometimes a gun involved. And so you have to think about what you're doing when you're teaching your child to think about their ecosystem. Do your children know that prairie is their ecosystem? Do they know how it is being treated and how it might be preserved? Do you know a prairie cicada? You shake hands with a prairie cicada. You shake hands with a meadow vole that stands on your foot and doesn't really realize that you're a human just about to destroy their landscape. So in downtown Champaign, it has become an insult to have your front of your storefront as partially as a warehouse where we keep shovels and loppers and equipment to do prairie work. We don't run out to Bonneville to get ecosystem management tools. It doesn't look good on a corridor where you're wanting to put in a 250 million ice hockey team to have a venue. So someone has to speak. Someone has to say, where's the compromise? So the little pocket prairie that we had across the road, which taught people what a prairie was like and what might be better if you could go 20 miles to see a decent prairie at Rantoul. So we moved to pocket prairie. It went to the Big Dig, the detention pond, and it's growing, but it's growing popsicle size, whereas we had a pocket prairie with trees and edge timbers and prairie. And parklands don't do that. Parklands have popsicle trees, not ecosystems. And ecosystems are dangerous. My daughter might get raped in that mess that you have out there. But every time we go there, there are insects on that, the remnants of the pocket prairie. The plants that wanted shade have died. There's no trees nearby that give it shade. It floods. The purpose of the Big Dig is to, if you have a 5-inch rainfall, it floods and floods up on prairie, and then it goes down fairly quickly. And prairie can usually handle that. So the plants that don't do it. The plants that do it very well and become weeds almost. We have our own prairie weeds, like smartweed that grows in swampland. So we've been working at the warehouse to take it out. We don't have a replacement warehouse. It's too short a notice to find a warehouse. If any of you know a warehouse that we could use, that would be wonderful. We have a lot of supporters in various ways. Sometimes it's enough to bring food or to create an idea. And then we've had helpers. Mainly, we've had packer helpers and our own board members, and tremendous amount of lifting and putting. It's a little bit dangerous. You get a hernia if you're not very careful. But we have a lifting apparatus. If you're going to be big on this, and I think the time has come when recycling is getting bigger, we're asking you not to go out and buy another new car, but to use the car you have. I'm Australian in background. We have one model Holden, which was perhaps 70% of the vehicles in Australia, and it was the workhorse. It had a Chevrolet background or General Motors background, and they had it for years. It had the same pictorial flow. It would run races around Australia. It was a very practical car, and you didn't have to have 120 different images of it. You could work with it. And part of the extraction of this warehouse at Bonneville is to teach people how to use secondhand materials, how to take a screw and fix that handle, how to do something with hand. It's also to be modern. If we are working with older equipment, you have to be an older specialist. If you have a brace and bit, then you have to know how to put the head of it at your stomach and wind the bit in, or you have to have those pieces of equipment. Antique people like to do that, but at the moment we have motorized chainsaws, and they're small, and you can get into an invasive plant without having a belted chain saw and a motor that's heavy as lead. Then you have to have a registration, a license to use it, and it's, if you don't have the belt just the right tension, it will snap, or if it's too loose, it'll fall off. So we do technology. We have dollies that are huge, like 10 feet long with 9-inch wheels, and you can move them around by hand. But working with those dollies, you can load them with material, wood, but a front-end loader is tremendously helpful. So if Packer expands, and I think Packer should expand, because we need repair and maintenance above and beyond a 50-year-old house. We need to teach people how to reuse, and how to reuse sensibly, and not to be filling the territory with new that we haven't tested yet. It's axiomatic that technology is wonderful if you can get ADA, or you can get genetic material and do things with it, and do GMOs, and the yield goes up, and it's wonderful. But you have to know that the technocrats leave holes, and then you get people moving into those holes, and you get scam artists, and you get people taking shortcuts. And so we have to have a moral code where this doesn't screw us over. So if we make a technological advance and have hundreds of TV monitors lying around on county roads, then that's part of the responsibility of scientists to fix that up, and not to necessarily bitch about people doing wrong things. They're filling holes that are left by the technologies. Interesting thoughts. And we have more of them. And if you want to come and help us get out of the warehouse, Amazon wants to be in quickly, and the best we can do is to get out quickly. And we have wood. We have not much left. We have acoustic sound boxes. WEF's noise assembly would go to this Bonneville warehouse and bang on various boxes and various pieces of metal, and that event would go up on WEF sessions, and so it's not necessarily the old is dumb. The old might be interesting. The people who have music in their minds are likely to like acoustic music because it's more rich in sound and not as crisp and brittle as electronic music. So they want sound absorption and sound relay that is different from what you're getting in your normal radio presentation. So I'm looking at the clock to see, I'm trying to think when we started. I think we might be overrun. I think I'm going to stop now, and we might have to decapitate me a little. I was on a rant today because I think people need to know that their ecosystem is important, and prairie is important, and those little yards in your backyard are important for a bumblebee and a creature, and you might have shade, so you might have a shade species, but you might be in the open and you have an open species. And you might have several species together. Sometimes rattlesnake master is a weed because it's got the right relationships. But if it doesn't have the right relationships with its pollinators and the like, then you think it's very rare. It's in the carrot family. It's anyway. I think I'm going to cool it now, and if we have space to put in support for WEFT. WEFT is a wonderful experience. It's been together for 40 years. It helps us do things like this, and we say thank you for that. It is wonderful music, and it has wonderful public service. Amy Goodman and Democracy Now! People arrange, and it survived because it is biodiverse, and we need it. We need it a lot. So this is Dave Monk of Prairie Monk, WEFT Champaign, 90.1 on your FM dial.